Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Clint with Scottish Plans Podcast, and I'm really excited to share with you some of the content I recorded in Scotland about 2 months ago. I'm busy. It's hard that I do this when I can, so it's 2 months ago. But it was a really cool experience. In fact, I'd describe it as epic. And I got to visit some of my favorite locations the locations of some of my favorite stories. And the story that I'm going to share with you here, as we move from different location to different location and follow the story as it happened. This is the story that I've gone into more detail on the podcast. It is the origin story of the Stewarts of Appin, and it describes a struggle that brings three major clans together on different sides and different loyalties. It has all of the best ingredients of some of the best books, movies, TV shows. It's got action, it's got loyalty, it's got betrayal, it's got romance, faithfulness and infidelity. It's got all of those ingredients there. While I don't go into as much detail necessarily in this as I did on the podcast, I actually go into a lot of detail here. I'm drawing heavily upon Stephen Boardman's work with the Campbell acquisition of Lorne, is what it's called. And yet that can be found in a book called Alba, Celtic Scotland in the Medieval Era. Let me know what follow-on questions you have in the comments below. Let me know what elements of this you thought were the most intriguing, as the story really takes a twist as we pull out more and more detail, or as Stephen Boardman pulls out more and more detail. Let me know what you think. I hope you enjoy this, and without further ado, I'm going to pitch you over to the story. Thanks.
All right, this is Dunstaffnage Castle. This was the seat of the Lord of Lorne. Originally, that would have been MacDougall's. They were the ones who built this. They were the senior line of the descendants of Somerled, senior to the MacDonalds, even though the MacDonalds would become more powerful later, and the McRorys, who were very powerful during their time as well. But first it was the MacDougall's. But because they sided against Bruce during the Wars of Independence, they decline in power and lose it. The next Lords of Lorne, after the MacDougall's, were the Stewarts. And here's where the real fun part of the story comes in. So the Stewart Lords of Lorne, this was their main seat, was Dunstaffnage Castle. So maybe we'll do a little walk around. We're sharing it with other people so you can see different. Let's go over this way. You can see my biggest fan. Not the person most interested in Scottish history, but my biggest fan. Anyway, so the way the story goes with John, Lord of Lorne, is John Stewart, he'd had an affair. He has a wife who had only given him two daughters. Yet, he had an affair with a McLaren woman, and after his wife had passed away, he decided to marry her. Not like right after. Come on. He's got some decency. But about 5 years later, and by that time, the son that they had together was a result of their affair. His name was Dougal. He was coming of age. But as long as his parents aren't married to each other, he's not legitimate and therefore can't inherit the lordship of Lorne. Well, eventually, his father, John Stewart, decides to marry his McLaren mistress and make Dougal legitimate. And I still to this day wonder if it wasn't her idea. But we could get to that later. The main part, the cool part of the story is they decide to get married. And here in the castle of Dunstaffnage, they would have been having this grand party. And I'm trying to imagine this atmosphere here with just all the music and feasting and dancing and all the elements of a party that you could throw if you were in the nobility during the mid-1400s. So we'll go, so they party it up, and then it's time to actually get married, and that takes us to the next location.
Okay, so to my left, your right, we have Dunstaffnage Castle. That's where the party took place, the pre-marriage party. They're in there partying it up, dancing, drinking, having a great time. Great music, all the party stuff of a nobleman of the mid-1400s. You have John Stewart, Lord of Lorne. You have his McLaren almost bride, Dougal, who's coming of age, his almost of age, but not quite legitimate son. can't quite inherit anything yet because he's not a legitimate child as a result of an affair. So, according to the way they ran it back then. All right, so they're going to leave the castle and they're going to make their way. Now it's time to seal the deal, right? And so we're going to go down this path here to the chapel. Problem was, it's not so simple. They set out from the castle, pipes playing, the wedding march, they're coming out grand style. It's going to be harder than it sounds to just get 180 yards to the chapel. All right, now we have some wonderful guest actors in our video today. My daughter's here. But what I wanted to show you was that you can see the castle. So 180 yards, a lot of people don't have that in their head. So for those of you who have been anywhere near like a football game or a track and field event, the track is usually a quarter mile, 400 meters. 180 yards is less than halfway around. So there's the castle. You can see through the trees there. Now, Sarah, if you will kind of show the audience what it looks like around here. And I don't know what the vegetation looked like during the time that this is taking place, mid 1500s, 1463, I believe, is when this exact event was taking place. So I don't know how old these trees are. That would play a lot into where's the best place to ambush from, right? But if you'll rotate the camera here, here's the chapel they were marching to. Like it's like you could stone throws. Like it's not that far. So the procession leaves the castle, and somewhere between there and the chapel, John Stewart's party gets ambushed by who? By MacDougall's. And now I don't know where the best place where they were hiding was, because like I said, what the vegetation looked like at the time would have played a big part in this. Were they just down over the hill there that you can see kind of drops off over there? That's where I think even with or without the trees would be the best place to use that hill. But I don't know if that spot would be the best because you can kind of see that from the castle. So probably the best place to hide in ambush would be this direction here to the north. That would be the better location. Let the terrain hide you and conceal your forces there, because I think they could have got in a position there without being seen at the castle. That's just my guess. I've never read that in any scholarly works, but if I were Alan of the Wood, I'd probably let this hill hide me and my forces. I don't know how many of them he had, but he brought up his MacDougals and whoever else was allied with him, and they ambushed this wedding party. Now this is a big deal with who does the lordship of Lorne pass down to. Is it going to be Dougal or not? Well, if this marriage doesn't happen, he's not legitimate and he can't be recognized. So they get ambushed here. Key personnel. So let's walk as we tell the rest of this story. Key personnel, people that have to survive this ambush, are John Stewart, his soon-to-be McLaren bride, and his still at this time illegitimate son Dougal. So they and the priest, but I don't know if the priest was in the party or if he was already waiting at the chapel. But those people have to survive the ambush, and they do. Well, John Stewart barely. He was severely wounded, and with his dying breaths in this very chapel right here, the priest unites them in marriage, making Dougal legitimate. The problem is, he'd signed an agreement 11 years earlier that with his brother Walter and his two sons-in-law, one of whom would become the first Earl of Argyll, Colin Campbell, he signed an agreement 11 years before this saying that Walter will be the next Lord of Lorne. This is during a time period where John only had two, probably at the time, young daughters. And so Walter's the next most likely person. So he signs this agreement. He signed it. He said. So where it looks like maybe Walter is plotting with the Campbells because he's jealous of, he wants the title. No, this is what the agreement was. So a change to this, the whole Dougal getting the lordship of Lorne, that was the change. So the big question I have is, whose idea was it to change the agreement and make it so that Dougal is now the heir to the lordship of Lorne? Was it the McLaren bride who sees, like, why wouldn't my male heirs get the lordship? I don't know. That's speculation a little bit, but nevertheless, the agreement had been signed in 1452. And you can read Stephen Boardman's paper on that I'll have a link to the book that paper is found in below. You can buy that on Amazon. Let's go take a look at the chapel. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here's the chapel where this really, really, really important wedding happened. So, and if you're thinking, well, it wasn't that important because he'd already signed an agreement 11 years before this, so Dougal's not the heir anyway. See, the kin or the greater clan looked at it this a little bit different than the Scottish government did. For them, they would accept somebody who is illegitimate as a leader. And there's a lot of examples of that through the history of the Scottish clans. So making Dougal a legitimate heir may have strengthened it as far as a leader of the kindred, which that actually worked. Dougal does become the founder of the Stewarts of Appin. So let's tell the rest of the story, what happened here from the chapel. So this is where, in his dying breaths, severely wounded, John Stewart, Lord of Lorne, marries his MacLaren, up until this point, mistress, and now Dougal's legitimate. And it looks like on the surface, there's two things that it looks like on the surface. One is that the MacDougals may be just still bitter because the Lordship of Lorne passed out of their family through heiresses into the Stewarts of Intermeath, and that's this family that John Stewart comes from. And so they're just taking it out on the Stewarts because they're still bitter that went out of their family. The MacDougals aren't the top dogs in Lorne anymore. And another thing that it looks like on the surface is that Walter Stewart is this bitter brother who's going to go into cahoots with the Campbells, who are just trying to get all the land they can get, right? That's the whole narrative of the whole history of the Clan Campbell. Got a plane going overhead, interrupting my super important video. Okay, the two things that looks like on the surface is, one, the MacDougals are bitter, like sore losers. The Lordship of Lorne went out of their hands through marriage, through heiresses, to the Stewarts. And there's the other thing that looks like on the surface, and that's that Walter's also bitter because he's not getting the Lordship of Lorne. It looks like everybody's just bitter because they don't get the Lordship of Lorne, and they're conspiring to take it out of the hands of John's almost legitimate son, Dougal. And according to Stephen Boardman in the paper that he wrote on this, the Campbell acquisition of Lorne, neither one of those are the case. Let's start with the first, with Walter. Walter, in the 1452 entail, which was signed by John, Walter, and John's two sons-in-laws, one who had become the first Earl of Argyll, Colin Campbell. According to that document they all signed, Walter was supposed to get the Lordship of Lorne after John. He was the next in line for it. So where did this whole plan of passing it down to Dougal come from? I suspect, this is just a suspicion, this is not corroborated in any document that any scholarly paper I've ever read. Is it possible that this MacLaren woman sees the way that it's originally planned to go and is starting to plant it in John's head to let their posterity have the lordship? It's John that departs from the agreement, not Walter. And as far as people, well, of course the Campbells are in it to try to get more land because they're always gobbling up other people's land. Actually, they seem pretty cold to the whole idea. The Campbells, not only they seem cold enough that Walter has to offer them part of the lands that he would inherit as the next Lord of Lorne in order to get them really that interested in helping him get what's coming to him per the agreement. They're not even really that interested until he starts offering them land. And then probably most of us would have been interested at that point anyway. So we're not going to hold it against the Campbells. So there's one thing that Stephen Boardman busts. That's part of the story that the traditional telling makes it look like. The other part, MacDougals. Of course, it was the MacDougals that ambushed this wedding party, and it's just them bitter because they lost the lordship. Actually, what's another really interesting side story to this that could make its own awesome story is that at the same time as all this is happening, there is an internal struggle amongst the MacDougals as far as who is going to be the leader of the clan, the chief. And the two people fighting over it are half brothers, Alan of the Wood and Ian Ciar. They're half brothers, so they both got the same dad, who's the previous chief of the MacDougals. Now, this chief's wife, the actual wife, is the sister to Colin Campbell, who's going to be the first Earl of Argyll. His mistress is, we think, maybe, according to this paper that I read by Stephen Boardman, maybe the sister of Donald Balloch MacDonald, who is the acting Lord of the Isles. The real Lord of the Isles is way more concerned with the earldom of Ross and spends a lot of time up by Inverness and Dingwall in that area. Donald Balloch is the one who's wielding the real power in the Isles. May have been his sister that was this MacDougall chief's mistress, and Alan's mom. So you have Alan of the Wood, his mom is Donald Balloch MacDonald's sister. Ian Ciar, the legitimate heir and the one who's probably going to get the chiefship of the MacDougalls, his mother is the sister to Colin Campbell. Okay, so you have these really powerful clans who, by this time, that whole stereotype of the MacDougalls always fighting the Campbells, that's not a thing yet. But it does pit them on opposite sides of the struggle, this inter-MacDougall struggle. Well, if you're John Stewart, Lord of Lorne, who do you pick? The same gentleman that married one of your daughters, his sister is Ian Ciar's mom. So the Stewarts join with the Campbells in supporting Ian Ciar for that. Now, Alan of the Wood's not really ready to take out retribution on the Campbells, but he can take it out on the Stewart Lords of Lorne. And so it looks like it's not the whole MacDougall clan that does this ambush. It's those who follow Alan of the Wood and are backed by the MacDonalds and who want to take it out on the Stewarts for supporting an earlier battle that happened on the Isle of Carrara, which I know how to pronounce now because I just did a cruise, and it's not Carrera. According to the locals in this area, it's Carrara. Alan of the Wood, who led the ambush earlier, had kidnapped his half-brother, Ian Ciar, and took him away captive onto the island of Carrara. Oh no, this part of the MacDougalls that support Ian Ciar and the legitimate son of the MacDougall chief, it looks like their story's almost up until Colin Campbell, who would be the first Earl of Argyll and the cousin of Ian Ciar, comes to the rescue. He comes with his galley host, it says, all his ships. A lot of people don't think of the Campbells as a Hebridean clan. We think of galley hosts as being something that has to do with MacDonalds, MacLeans, MacLeods, McKinnons maybe, but not so much the Campbells. But we forget that the Campbells' territory is the west coast of Argyll. They have the chief has a galley host, and Colin brings it, and he finds Alan of the Wood with his captain Ian Ciar on the Isle of Carrara, and he brings his host through and destroys Alan of the Wood's fleet. Was it all MacDougall ships, or do we have MacDonald ships in there? I don't know who he destroyed, but he moves through and just destroys this fleet of Alan of the Woods, or whoever was supporting him. They just about wipe out all of Alan's forces, and even Alan himself makes it out by the skin of his teeth. Barely with his life does he make it out of this. Colin Campbell saves the day, rescues his cousin, and puts him back in charge, and he does continue on to succeed as the chief of the MacDougalls. And in that effort of Colin rescuing his cousin, the Stewarts had supported him, probably with men contributed to that cause. So this ambush that takes place in between the church and the chapel and the castle Dunstaffnage, that ambush was only the MacDougalls who were loyal to Alan and trying to take it out on the Stewarts for siding with Ian Ciar and taking that side. So a couple of things that are busted. I originally only knew about the very plain version of this, which you can go and listen to episode 8 on the podcast. That's the original version. And I thought that in and of itself was a pretty wild story. However, after I read this paper, you have Stephen Boardman just peeling back the layers, and every time he does, it gets more and more interesting and all these other things going on. It turned out to be an even wilder story, and now that I had the chance to actually be on the ground and see where it happened, I wanted to share it with you guys. All right, so now that we have told the story about how Dougal, his parents survived the ambush, they got married, sealed the deal, now Dougal is legitimate, but that still leaves so many things, loose ends, untied. For one, after the wedding party got ambushed, the MacDougals who did the ambushing turned around and occupied Dunstaffnage Castle. So even if Dougal was going to become the Lord of Lorne, which he didn't, that went to Walter, his uncle. So what does Dougal do? The MacDougals, don't get them confused between Dougal and MacDougall, but the MacDougals have control of Dunstaffnage Castle, which was his father's castle. So what does he do? Well, he actually takes those who are loyal to him, and see, in Highland clan society, it wasn't always the person who the government decided should be the leader was the leader. A lot of it had to do with who did the clan have trust in as their leader. And it appears that Walter was never able to secure the trust of his people. Even though the lordship of Lorne did in fact go to him, he was never in effect the Lord of Lorne. In fact, just a few years later, he abdicated. The Campbells actually received that lordship to themselves and did eventually get the lordship of Lorne, did receive Dunstaffnage Castle. But the MacDougals would hold that castle for several more years. Dougal, Stewart, the son of John Stewart, he would have the trust of his people and whoever else was part of this group of people that was becoming Clan Stewart of Appin. That would have included some of his mom's kin, the MacLarens. That would have included other groups of people who joined in the fight with them. Turns out Dougal was somebody that people could put their trust and confidence in as their leader. But where did he go and what did he do in the years following? The MacDougals would hold Dunstaffnage Castle for several more years. Well, what he did is he took his followers and he headed north of Loch Craren, to the part of Lorne that was known as Appin, which is where we are now. And in fact, we're looking at Castle Stalker in the background. This castle was once just a fortified hunting lodge that Dougal and his followers took, built into Castle Stalker, and used this as their base of operations. This was the seat of the Stewarts of Appin. So Dougal spent the next several years not only developing this as his home, but also leading his followers in raids into Campbell territory nearby. The Campbells became very frustrated with this and went and talked to Alan of the Wood and said, hey, we need you guys to actually get into a decisive engagement with Dougal and his group, and we need to put a stop to this, which leads us to the Battle of Lacadoha. I don't have a lot of details about the battle, but it ended up being a stalemate. There were heavy casualties on both sides. Now, some of the traditional accounts of this battle say that the MacFarlanes, who were fighting with the MacDougals and under Alan of the Wood, were wiped out and it completely destroyed their fighting strength. Well, we know that that's not true because you see them in the future popping up and very active militarily. What might have happened, though, is that the chief of the MacFarlanes only sent some of his men to be engaged in this and that all of them were killed. So there could be an element of truth there. Either way, neither side won nor lost. The lines didn't move in the boundaries between the two forces. But years later, there would be a decisive engagement, and this would be known as the Battle of Stalk. And in this engagement, there was a clear winner. Dougal and the men of Appin secured a sound defeat over Alan of the Wood and his forces, which, keep in mind, were only part of the MacDougals, not the whole clan. There was inter-clan strife, and his half-brother, Ian Ciar, would actually become a legitimate MacDougall of Dunolly. Those who followed Alan of the Wood, though, they met with a disastrous defeat, and tradition tells us that Dougal killed Alan of the Wood with his own hand. And even though that the Dougal would never succeed as the actual Lord of Lorne, he did become the founder of the Clan Stewart of Appin. And this was his base, Castle Stalker, right behind me. Really cool to see the actual locations as we tell these stories. Marschen leven de Rasta.